Last week I was talking about the effects of making big cuts and boosts when EQing. We discussed phase shifts as well as the effect on non-linear processes, especially when boosting high end, as this can cause aliasing. Now, many may have watched that and left with the impression that EQing heavily into compression is something that should be avoided. Now, for the most part, it is advisable to EQ after compression, as this allows the compressor to react more evenly to the source. Now, what I mean by this is that its detection is being controlled by the natural dynamics of the source. You see, you set your threshold, and anything that goes above that threshold will be compressed, and if set right, it will result in a very even and level sounding source. So by compressing before EQ, it means that it only reacts to the natural dynamics of the source, which in most cases is how we want compression to work, to reduce the overall dynamic range of the source. So hopefully this makes sense as to why many would advise not EQing into compression, as your EQ moves will have an effect on what exceeds the threshold and engages the compression. This is why we use sidechain high-pass detectors in compressors, so that on certain sources our low end doesn't trigger the compression. This is very, very common for mix bus compression, as we just want the compressor to shave off the excessive peaks in the mids caused by our snare, vocals, guitars, etc., whilst leaving our big low end intact. If you don't sidechain your detection, then it's possible that your low end will start to make the compression pump, which, dependent on the style or genre, is something that is pretty undesirable. However, a sidechain is technically very different from simply cutting the EQ going into the compressor, as the original frequency response of the source isn't affected by the sidechain. It's purely the detection to the compressor that has been cut, whereas obviously cutting EQ into a compressor means that those frequencies are physically reduced. This is why many engineers opt for dynamic EQ when dynamically taming certain tonal elements, and use compression for overall reduction of dynamic range. And I suppose that then leads to the question of,
why would anybody, especially a pro like CLA, want to heavily boost high frequency content into a compressor to compress an already naturally compressed guitar amp?
And I suppose he's probably got a point. Why would you add more of a phase shift for a compressor to attenuate that frequency range? Surely that breaks every rule that we are taught as beginners. You are creating more of an audible phase shift by boosting more than you need, and it means that the compressor is heavily reacting to that specific frequency range, and also dependent on the compressor, is creating a lot of high order harmonics, which in the digital domain can create audible aliasing. And not only that, we are compressing guitar amp recordings, which most beginners are told not to compress, as the guitar cabs and speakers already add their own form of compression. Right, let's answer this step by step. First off, the CLA method I am referring to is his infamous 8K trick that he commonly uses on electric guitars. Chris is known to boost a crap ton of 8K on his SSL and then feed that into an LA3A and use the compression to dial back the harshness of the 8K boost. And many of you will be screaming,
but this will add audible aliasing!
In the digital domain, yes, it's possible dependent on the amount of 8K and the wideness of the cue, but CLA has been doing this analog from the start. Remember, aliasing is purely a digital artifact, and it does not occur in the analog realm. But what you also have to remember is that compression works differently to saturation. When we heavily saturate a frequency range, it only heavily saturates that frequency range. But with compression, not only do we reduce the level of that frequency range, we also increase the level of the lower frequency ranges. Remember the fundamentals of compression. It squashes the dynamic range. So when CLA uses the LA3 to clamp down on the level of that 8K boost, he also increases the lower level dynamic parts of the guitar. This in turn adds what we call glue without making the guitars sound smaller. And this is why he gets away with compressing an already compressed source, because the way he uses it, it's not really squashing the dynamic range of the whole source, but by using it to tame the level of the 8K boost, it rounds off the harshness of the high frequencies and in turn makes the guitars feel a little bit more weighty by increasing some of the low frequency content, as guitars normally are very mid-forward. Add this to the colour of the LA3, which by design is pretty low mid emphasised and rounded in the top end, you get a bitey sounding guitar sound without a lot of harshness. Now this is just me, but I do presume that CLA did this to counter and smooth out the thinness and fizziness of the SSL EQs, as I'll show you in this example. So as you can hear, the LA3 does a very good job of adding in that weight that the SSL lacks. It adds in the mid-range without feeling like it's too piercing and fatiguing on the ears. And for anybody asking about the trade-off with phase, truth is, it just doesn't matter, as the end result sounds pretty damn good. Remember, these guys aren't worrying about phase all of the time. All they care about is whether the end justifies the means, which for me in this instance, it does. And this got me thinking, what about if you want to add bite to the guitars and you don't have an SSL EQ or an LA3A emulation? What about if you don't like the sound of an SSL 8K boost and you want to try a Neve or API and tame that with a FET or a Verimue compressor? Well, as we all know, I like to make my own plugins using Melda MXXX, and I couldn't resist the opportunity to create my very own bite plugin, which consists of 5 EQs and 5 compressors. I've basically taken Melda's Turbo EQ and Turbo Comp emulations and macroed them all up so I can get the 8K boost of their variation of SSL, Neve, API, Pultec and Manly Massive Passive, and then tame that back with 5 different options of compressors. There's also auto gain compensation on the EQs and the compressors, and I've also added in an optional oversampling mode, which I basically have on by default, but you can switch it off as well. If you are a Melda MXXX user, I will make the preset available for channel members and Patreon members, and if you're not a member, then just experiment yourself, please, with what you have. Please don't be afraid to try these things out and actually learn why many pros break the rules. So, to finish up, I'll let you hear lots of variations of this technique so you can hear for yourself why it's worth experimenting with. And if you want more videos like this, then smash that like button before you go. And if you really want to help support the channel, consider donating a super thanks, or alternatively, become a channel or Patreon member. Either way, my name's Paul Third, and as always, I'll see you again next week.